I think, like, carrying on from what Shabbir was saying, I think the term post-truth politics is particularly popular right now. And I think there's some legitimacy in us as the left responding to that. I think we need to root ourselves firmly in the politics of truth and respond effectively to certain issues. One, for example, is the housing crisis. So Goldsmiths is situated in a part of southeast London that is undergoing mass gentrification and forcing people out of their communities. The image of our institution as progressive and radical is being used on billboards to sell luxury flats and as a pillar of division in our community. I think we're seeing this in general as part of the neoliberalisation and marketisation of our education system. We're seeing tuition fees rising, possibly up to £12,000 by 2020. We're seeing, just university being more inaccessible to more people. And I think, for Goldsmiths in particular, our radical image, we had some amazing professors out there. We've had people like Stuart Hall coming out of that institution, a lot of people from like the New Left Review and stuff coming out of the institution. I think it's falling into the hands of the marketeers, particularly Goldsmiths, to sell to prospective students. And over the last few years, we've seen a dramatic increase in the price of halls of residence across the country. And in our university, some halls of residence have risen by £50 a week over the last couple of years. So to put that in perspective, some students at Goldsmiths are paying £299 a week for their halls of residence, which is just like ridiculous. So obviously this is pricing out the most marginalised people and works as yet another blockade to accessing education. With the price of education and accommodation just setting to rise, we started a campaign to lower the price of halls on campus. The aim was to get halls to be half of the average maintenance loan and be capped at that. So if we're basing it on around a 40-week contract, at the moment we're looking to get halls down to £100 and 20 pence a week. After discussions of how we're going to do that, going through like various different things such as occupations, protests, we realised that the most effective method to reach these aims was through withholding rent from the university management. Whilst what we were asking for is not particularly radical, and even the passivity of withholding rent cannot be seen as a radical act, we made sure we took up space in a really radical way. When we organised prefiguratively. So that's to say that we acted inside these spaces in a way that we wanted to see being acted outside these spaces. We thought that was really important as part of our organising. We organised in a grassroots, non-hierarchical manner and reached decisions on a direct democratic consensus basis. What was really important to us is that we rebuilt the community that the neoliberal individualism that our education system fostered had attempted to destroy. So I think it's really important in all movements that we're rebuilding that community and rebuilding those ties. We decided to interact with local businesses and local social spaces in a new way. We talked to them, organised with them, and they aided in our campaign. Our goal was to situate Goldsmiths firmly inside and for the community that it found itself in. Although I've made some progress, we haven't necessarily reached our end goals to date. We have achieved many other aims in the process though. We have created these spaces and furthered a sense of resistance on campus, one that's almost been, that we're thinking is a new way of forming the resistance that we saw in 2010 against the tripling of tuition fees. We have created networks of self-care and mutual care. We've sparked a wider movement in the rest of the country, with the NUS supporting rent strikes across the country in January, which is like a really, really, really exciting move and really could like put the fire back into the student movement. I think in this time it's important that our actions are taking individual issues seriously. To take individual issues seriously, we need to tackle political issues such as the housing crisis and understand the way that different people with different experiences are affected by the austerity of our times. We need to be continually creating spaces of radicalness, care, respect, and understanding, all through like the idea of intersectional politics, whilst fighting and winning our demands. I think it's important that we are being intersectional with everything we do. We're understanding how different oppressions affect different people. I think that's really important in all of our organising. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Liam. So we're going to have one more speaker and then we're going to open the floor up to questions. So have a think if you have any questions. Our next speaker, I think, can be summarised quite well in that I was talking to Jenny, our designer, at the back before, and she simply just said, Tariq Ali's just walked in. He's a hero of my generation. So I thought that was quite nice. So, Tariq.
I must apologize in advance because I have to leave after I speak. Stupidly, I'd forgotten that meetings never start on time on university campuses, but forgive me for that. I think it's the latest news which we heard today is that a lot of independent bodies have now admitted that in terms of the country's economy as it has been run since 2008, that we will not get back to even the 2008 levels for another 2 decades. That's what they've said. And there's going to be appalling problems, especially for people already on the lower rungs of the ladder. What these news items do not tell us and do not say is how is it that people who are already wealthy can manage to accumulate more wealth day after day, week after week, month after month, where it's the poor and the less well-off who suffer. And the answer to that is very simple, that the reason this happens is because politicians want it to happen. And any serious attempt to challenge the existing policies in Europe and North America of politicians of centre-left or centre-right are denounced. The way Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell have been treated in the media is an example of that. Non-stop attacks. Why? Because they propose some alternatives. And these alternatives, to be perfectly frank, are incredibly mild alternatives. But they don't want to permit even the most elementary forms of social democracy, of rebuilding the destroyed infrastructures in our society, of forcing students to take out loans and pay for their education, something which almost every government opposed till Blair came to power. It was Tony Blair and Gordon Brown who agreed to student fees in the first place, not the Tories, worth remembering that. And of course it's been taken on. And this leader of the Labour Party we've got now, Jeremy Corbyn, is the first to suggest that possibly we could find a way of ending the restrictions on higher education by the imposition of fees. And when they tell you that the money isn't there, they're lying. Because A, the money is available, B, more wealth can be created, and we know the money is available because they never have any problems of finding money when they want to go to war. Never a problem. Millions, billions can be found to bomb countries, to occupy countries, to insist that this country behaves as if it is still an imperial state when effectively it's a tiny Northern European country on the edge of Europe. I mean, that's what it is. And were Scotland to defect, it would be tinier still. So what is the point of a country this size trying to play a role it can no longer afford to play, and punishing the people, the majority of its population, on every single level, social, educational, and creating a society which is more divided now than it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s, because even under previous Labour governments, pre-Blairite governments, under the Wilson government, of which many of us were very critical, there actually was a small redistribution of wealth. They didn't do away with redistribution, that Labour government. They did many stupid things and wrong things, but that was one thing they stuck to. And this notion, which is sort of pressed into us, that redistribution is impossible, it's a utopian demand, is completely ridiculous. It never was, and it never is. It can be fought for, and it can be won. Which is why the debate on Trident was so important. And we've lost that for the time being. But it's a debate which should not be given up, because anyone with the slightest intelligence knows that this missile is of no use to Britain at all. It doesn't defend anyone, it can only be used with American approval, and if the Americans want to use nuclear missiles, which I hope they never do, but we don't know, they have their own submarines to do it all over the world. So why should Britain maintain the Trident and waste all this money, and more money is going to be spent on them, and at the same time tell us that it can't operate the National Health Service without privatizing it, that they can't maintain a free university education, that they're letting the state school system flounder and setting up these absurd academies so more groups of people effectively outside the education system can make money, and this has to end. And that is why it's been extremely positive. And one of the big social movements we've seen in this country has been the entry of, hundreds and thousands of people, young and old, to join or rejoin the Labour Party and maintain Jeremy Corbyn in power as leader of the Labour Party against another faction of the Labour Party which is set in its ways and which refuses to accept that the neoliberal system which they all participated in creating and said was the only alternative is dead in the water. It died in 2008 as a result of the economic crisis, and they will not accept it. So they carry on saying, oh yes, tinkering. Nothing substantial has been done to change the structures of global capitalism since the collapse of 2008. And this is why, where there is no left alternative, we fortunately have one at the moment, in the fact that the Labour Party is under the leadership of a person who actually considers himself a socialist and is very good on virtually every foreign policy issue, including Trident, including nuclear disarmament. It's the first time we've had a leader of the Labour Party good on both domestic and foreign policy issues at the same time. Not happened before. Unless you go back to George Lansbury. Of course, he was similar too, but that's going back a very long way, even in Labour Party history. So here we have had a turn which has provided an alternative. In those countries where no such alternative was provided or allowed to come into being, you see the results. Trump's victory in the United States, the extreme right thinking they're on the verge of power in France, right-wing governments in Hungary and Poland, hardly mentioned in the media, which is very happy to attack the Latin American countries trying to help their people. And so there is everything to fight for, because where you have a vacuum and where the left can't fill the vacuum, forces on the right come and do it. There is an explanation for that. And where the center, the left and right center, which has dominated politics, no longer can offer anything to people except the very rich. With the exception of Iceland, no one has punished the bankers and the politicians who were responsible for the 2008 crisis. Iceland is the only country which tried and imprisoned the bankers for behaving as they did, and got rid of the politicians. Nowhere else in Europe has this happened, leave alone the United States, where no one was punished, though Wall Street was responsible for the crash. So in this, what do? We fight. we create mass movements, we try and help the mass movements build either new parties or other parties which exist and are prepared to move forward. And we're lucky this has happened here at the present time. So there's everything to fight for. The tragedy is that Labour, which now is the largest political party in Europe with 500,000 members, astonishing. None of us, I don't think, ever accepted this, thought that this would happen again. We were not prepared for it. We didn't expect it to happen, nor did Corbyn for that matter. But it's happened because of the anger that exists amongst ordinary people. And if the parliamentary Labour Party, which still believes it's living in the times of Blair and Brown and Cameron, carry on in the same way, all they will do is actually help, aid and prepare the defeat of their own party and effectively back the Tories. That's the alternative, is either for an independent, radical Labour to sweep the country. It sounds very difficult, but don't forget that the political mood is very volatile. Which is why it's interesting how in some constituencies a Corbyn Labour Party is winning votes back from UKIP, to which many working people had defected, thinking that, perhaps they offered answers. But naturally, they're collapsing, which is a good thing, because people can see they didn't offer any answers. And in the United States too, as someone has already said, huge movements are building up against Trump. So there are many, many things that can be done. The one thing that should not be done is to simply sit on our backsides and think that someone else is going to do it for us. You have to move. You have to be active. You have to struggle. You have to fight. That's how every single demand was won. For women's rights by the suffragettes, mass movement to win the right of women to vote. By workers to form trade unions. This didn't happen just like that. There's a long, long struggle to build trades unions in this country and other parts of the world. And we're at a situation now and at a time when we have to fight again. It's not going to happen for us because power and money are now more concentrated than they ever were for most of the 20th century. And the reason they were on the defensive in the 20th century is because the Russians made a socialist revolution, whose centenary many of us will be marking next year. A huge event that transformed world politics. And so that put our side on the offensive, even though defeats were suffered globally, and enabled liberation movements to win wars against their oppressors and against the empire. And also for most of the 20th century, there was no danger of a nuclear conflict. There was a balance of force. Now, without that balance, I tell you this honestly, there is a bigger danger of nuclear conflict in this century than there was in the last one. And the only power so far to have used nuclear weapons ever is the United States. Whether they will do it again, or the Israelis will, or who knows. But given the lack of control now over nuclear weapons, because in a free market world, many governments believe they can buy nuclear weapons, and they do, it's becoming incredibly dangerous. So the question now, and in a time when the media is so completely on the side of the establishments, including the liberal media, it depends on us, which we do, and we try to create alternatives, both on the internet, which is a huge leap forward, and by creating mass movements. So that's my strong advice is get active, win more people over, and make people understand no one's going to do it for you. You have to do it yourselves. Thanks.
Sorry about the sound system. I think I tried to hold it, but it doesn't sound like it's got any better, to be honest. But we're going to open the floor to questions now. So if you want to put your hand if you've got a question and say who it's addressed to, and try and keep it short and sweet if you can.
Hi, this is for the Stop the War coalition. I really support Stop the War. I'm Iraqi, so yeah. But what do you think of the fact that Stop the War and the left generally has been really silent on Russia's role in Syria and like the abhorrent things that they're doing? Because I remember when I remember reading articles about the horrendous strikes that Russia's doing, and this complete, disgusting silence from the Stop the War, saying it would cause some kind of unnecessary hysteria, which is just a really strange argument, seeing as you're a protest movement. So, what are your thoughts?
Should we stop into the table now?
Oh, sure. Okay. Hello.
Can
you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so I think to start with, I want to mention that as soon as Russia got involved in Syria, Stop the War did release a statement condemning Russian involvement in Syria, and consistently Stop the War have said in every statement since that we oppose all foreign intervention in Syria, not just Britain and America, but all foreign intervention in Syria. Historically speaking, a conflict cannot end by further intervention and further bombing. The conflict ends when there is a peace negotiation, essentially. And our role in Syria right now is exacerbating the conflict and is blocking the chance for a peace negotiation. We are actively giving weapons to Saudi Arabia, even though there's evidence that those weapons have been transferred to IS. We are supporting Turkey, who have been purchasing oil from IS, and we're refusing to engage in negotiations with other actors in the region. This, I think, is why Stop the War have called out the hysteria, and it is the right word to use, hysteria, around Russia, because although Russia has been involved in Syria, and we do oppose that and condemn it, we are based in Britain. We affect our government's decisions, and we can act, we can act in a way that changes our policy here in Britain. We have to recognize, like I said earlier, that even though there's euphemistic language used about no bombing zone or the idea of a humanitarian intervention, the record of the British establishment is proof enough that this doesn't exist. There is no such thing. The idea that we will get more involved and stop Russia from committing atrocities just isn't true. We can, like I said, we can look at the record of Britain in terms of its previous interventions, in terms of how it's behaving towards refugees who are, fleeing as a result of our actions, and question where these humanitarian motives actually come from. Sorry. I just want to say, so Stop the War have been, condemning Russia from the onset, and essentially we are based in Britain and we can affect our government's foreign policy positions.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, just on that point about, the situation in Syria, I suppose I think that, sort of echoing really what's just been said, that it is the responsibility for, British organisations to focus on the actions of their own government. And, I think the reason for that is really highlighted by what we're seeing in Yemen. right now. The situation in Yemen isn't really reported in mainstream media. 10,000 people have been killed in Yemen because of Saudi bombing in Yemen, and we don't see criticism of what's going on in Yemen because the British government supports the Saudi regime, is selling arms to the Saudi regime, is offering political, diplomatic support for that. So I think it's right to oppose all forms of intervention in Syria, all forms of intervention in Yemen, but we do have to be, we have to remember the role of our own government in these dreadful situations. Because if there was a balanced situation, why wouldn't we have balanced reporting of the situation in Yemen? Boris Johnson called for protests outside of the Russian embassy. Well, he's in a position where he could stop instantly the bombing in Yemen by withdrawing support for Saudi regime. So I don't think we should take lessons from people like Boris Johnson.
Could we possibly keep it to questions, please? Any further questions? Can we have a mic? Oh, actually, does this mic work better? Sounds like it does. Right, we'll go in. So our next speaker is the General Secretary of CND as well as the National Secretary of Left Unity. So we're very pleased to welcome Kate Hudson.
Thanks very much indeed, Ellie, and thanks for organising this meeting tonight. It's incredibly timely, as other speakers have mentioned, not least because of yesterday's autumn statement. You mentioned at the start that John had been intending to join us, but he can't because he's on question time. So I've just got a very brief message from John McDonnell. He says, the Chancellor's autumn statement offers no hope for the future. There'll be more taxes, more debt and more borrowing, and the dream of young people owning a home will remain a dream. It is a betrayal of the just about managing, the so-called jams the government claims to want to help. They are our friends and our neighbours, and they include many students. It's a national scandal that students today can graduate £44,000 in debt. Labour is pledged to bring back educational maintenance allowance for students in further education and maintenance grants for low and middle income students. I wish you all the very best for this evening. So, nice message from John McDonnell. I don't normally watch question time because I can't stand it, but as he's on, I might give it a chance tonight. So it was okay a minute ago, wasn't it? Then it started doing that. Anyway, I'll plough on. So I think yesterday's autumn statement shows that the austerity agenda is continuing. There's been a bit of rhetoric around making some kind of investment, but as John McDonnell actually said himself, it's too little, too late. When Theresa May came in as Prime Minister, she claimed that she was going to be working to reunite the country, that she was going to help those left behind, but in fact I think that's all proven to be just absolute nonsense. The country is getting more and more polarised in terms of wealth and poverty, and this autumn statement is going to do nothing whatsoever to address that. Meanwhile, all the cuts taking place, but as Tariq pointed out, the government is ploughing ahead, spending £205 billion on a new nuclear weapons system. They've already started cutting the metal, as they call it. So that's actually going ahead. And it's absolutely essential that we continue to work to secure the cancellation of the Trident replacement, because it is just money down the drain. And I think what Tariq said made that absolutely clear. It does nothing whatsoever to meet any of the security challenges that we face. There are things like terrorism, climate change, pandemics, organised crime, cyber warfare, all the things our own government says are the main challenges. Nuclear weapons do absolutely nothing whatsoever to meet any of those. In fact, they just put us at greater risk, because you can be sure if anyone's targeting nuclear weapons on anything, they're targeting them on other nuclear weapons states. They're not going to target nuclear weapons on countries without. So they're just putting us at greater risk. But of course, nuclear weapons aren't just a domestic question. They are an international question. The British arsenal is a small part of the global arsenal of 15,000 nuclear weapons. So I just want to look at nuclear weapons in the international context and some of the new developments. Shabbir said when he started off speaking that we live in an exceptionally dangerous time. And of course, Trump being elected, coming to the White House in January, that is making the world a much more dangerous place. You know, at the end of the day, he's a far-right, racist, homophobe and misogynist. You know, he's Islamophobic, I mean, a complete, total nightmare. Tariq talked about the rise of the far right across Europe. You know, we're going to potentially have Marine Le Pen as president of France. We've got far right presidents elsewhere. So that as a kind of trend in global politics is exceptionally dangerous. And the morning after the Trump election, I emailed a friend of mine who works in the peace movement in the United States. You know, my heart goes out to them, to be honest. And I said, what does this mean? What does this election mean in terms of war and peace now? And he said it would mean the escalation of US militarism in the Middle East, beginning with Syria. And I think that that's already clear that that's what Trump is going to be doing. He said a massive increase in US military spending, including spending $1 trillion on a new generation of nuclear weapons. So they're going to be nuclear rearming too. Increased tensions with China, both economic and military, doesn't seem like a good idea to me, and increased pressure on US allies to pay more for their militaries. You know, so we already know he's kind of question marks over NATO because he thinks that's the Americans protecting Europe. So the first thing he's going to do is say, all right, you've all got to stump up your fair share and pay more on the military. You know, so that's the kind of thing we're looking at. In terms of the nuclear angle then, with Trump, well, I think Shabbir mentioned it already. He wants to rip up the Iran nuclear deal. That is likely to push Iran down the road towards nuclear weapons. If they go down that road, then we can be sure that Egypt and Saudi Arabia will consider going down that road. So you're going to have more nuclear weapons states. There was quite a lot of coverage in the election contest about things that Trump said about nuclear weapons, and they were his ignorance was incredibly shocking, but he made some pretty alarming comments. He said, if we've got them, why can't we use them? So not great that he's going to have his finger on the nuclear button. And particularly alarming for us, he said he was open to nuking Europe because it's a big place. You know, so great. But I suppose most dangerously in policy terms, he's said multiple times that more countries should get nuclear weapons. And he says that Japan and South Korea should get nuclear weapons to counter North Korea, and he's happy about a nuclear arms race in East Asia. I mean, really. This is a complete kind of turnaround in the policy towards nuclear weapons, which has kind of dominated the world for the last many decades. And that has been the idea that proliferation of nuclear weapons is not a good idea. You know, basically everyone is bought into the idea, more or less. Few countries have, you know, broken out of that, but basically the consensus globally has been that proliferation is not a good idea. And so he now, in these statements, has called into question what's been US policy and global policy, that we should not have proliferation of nuclear weapons. So, amongst other things, this questions his commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. For those of you familiar with this, maybe not, this came into force in 1970, and this is what put into international law the idea, or not the idea, the reality that the nuclear weapons states should disarm and countries that don't have them shouldn't get them. You know, that's the kind of balance that's dominated since 1970. Now, of course, there have been major flaws with this treaty. For one thing, it hasn't prevented all proliferation. Pakistan, India, Israel and North Korea are outside the treaty and have developed nuclear weapons, but compared to the kind of speculation, you know, that maybe 30, 40 countries would gain nuclear weapons. That was the thought in the 1960s. In fact, proliferation has been quite limited. And of course, it hasn't brought about nuclear disarmament. You know, we still have nuclear weapons in the world. But nevertheless, the NPT treaty is a kind of indication of where the global community thinks we should be in terms of nuclear weapons policy. And it's a kind of benchmark that we can aim for, you know, that everyone, at least nominally, has buy-in to now. And if you've got a US president who sanctions nuclear proliferation and says that other countries should be getting them, this is fine, and so on, we're heading on an extraordinarily dangerous path. You know, it's hard to overestimate that. Fortunately, he is completely out of step with the vast majority of world opinion. And I don't know if you're aware of this, particularly because this is the sort of thing that our news media doesn't bother to cover. They're not interested really on what goes on elsewhere in the world. The UN General Assembly has just voted that next year they will start negotiations for a global nuclear weapons ban treaty. You know, this is the overwhelming majority of countries in the world. So you've got Trump saying completely mad things about we must get more nuclear weapons and more countries should have them. And you've got the overwhelming majority of states in the world saying, no, actually, we've got to ban and eliminate all nuclear weapons. You know, so that's the kind of new fault line in the global debate around nuclear weapons. It would be nice to be able to say that Britain is supporting the idea of a global ban, because as you know, our government's always saying, well, we don't go along with CND because they're unilateralists, but we are for multilateral nuclear disarmament and we will do lots to achieve that. The second you get a multilateral initiative at the UN, they actually voted against it. You know, so I mean, typical hypocrisy from our government. It's quite interesting to look at who voted, the way the nuclear weapons states voted on this actually. The US, UK, France, Russia and Israel opposed a global nuclear ban treaty. China, India and Pakistan abstained, and North Korea voted in favour of a global nuclear ban. You know, so quite interesting developments. To wind up essentially, I mean, so there are basically two big challenges for us. One is to continue with our campaign to cancel Trident replacement, and I think we do have quite a lot on our side with this. There's a majority, most polls show a majority of the population against nuclear weapons. The government certainly can't afford to have them. New technologies like cyber warfare, underwater drone technology mean that even if you wanted to have nuclear weapons, it wouldn't be a very good idea to do it because they will be detectable, targetable, hackable, all those kinds of things. They could potentially even be turned against us. You know, so why would you do that? There's all kinds of reasons why it's going to be possible to get that replacement project cancelled. So that's one thing, to keep up that work. And the other is to put pressure on our government to actually go to these ban treaty negotiations next year at the UN and support multilateral nuclear disarmament through a ban treaty like they say they believe, you know. So we've got to do that. If you want to do that, you can go on our website and you can easily email Boris Johnson, bizarrely our Foreign Secretary, and tell him you want him to go along to New York and do that. Thank you very much.
Veteran of the peace movement, Bruce Kent.
Can you give me from here?
Yeah, just shout, Bruce. Just shout.
I've got the short end of the stick. Can you hear me? You can hear me. I've got the difficult job, shortly and briefly, to try and squeeze some money out of you. But let me just introduce myself first of all. I've been associated with CND for a long time, and I've always watched what the so-called opposition are up to. And I find that lots of the opposition are actually on our side, but we don't really realise it. Can I quote you a letter from Field Marshal Lord Bramble, General Lord Ramsbottom, and General Sir Hugh Beach? Anybody know them? Personal friends? No, probably not. Nevertheless, they ought to be here. They won't come, but they ought to be here, because what do they say? Writing in the Times, believe it or not, the force designed so-called independent nuclear weapons, this force cannot be seen as independent of the United States in any meaningful sense. Harold Wilson once distinguished himself by saying, our nuclear weapons were the Moss-Frost deterrent. Anybody know what Moss-Frost is? Where my generation, he went and hired your dinner jacket, he went to a posh dance. And Moss-Frost, totally dependent on the United States. Should this country ever become subject to some sort of nuclear blackmail from a terrorist group, it must be asked in what way and against whom our nuclear weapons could be used, or even threatened, to deter or punish. Nuclear weapons have shown themselves to be completely useless as a deterrent to the threats and scale of violence we are currently all likely to face, particularly international terrorism. And of course, they're completely useless in preventing accidents from happening. And we've had a string of accidents over the years. In Robert McNamara, American Secretary of State Defense, said we were saved not by our good judgment, but by good luck. So that's the background. We've got lots of allies that we don't really know about, which need to use more vigorously than we do. But we won't get anywhere without personal activity by individuals and by resources. I went to a meeting the other night for about 50 people, all on our side. And I asked how many of you have ever written a letter to a local paper or rung up the BBC or a programme about nuclear weapons. Total silence. Not one. Not one. I began to think there's a lot of activism we need to generate in amongst other people. But we also need money because we cannot put advertisements in papers, print leaflets, paper travel costs, all those things without some cash. Now I'm in a student building, and the most stupid thing is to ask students for cash. If they haven't got any cash, yes, I understand they haven't got any cash. But you've got a rich aunt somewhere, or you're a rich uncle somewhere, or a dear old granny, Christian CNDs are from £100,000 for no negative died and left them £100,000 they weren't expecting. So there's money out there to be got hold of. They'll be passing a bucket round shortly, hoping that you will cough up, not just for the evening, but generally. Sorry about this cough. But if you can't cough up money tonight, okay, I understand that. Get out a piece of paper and write on it, I promise to pay £5, £10, £15, £20, whatever you like, and put your name and email on it. So we'll know who you are and we can follow you up. You can squeeze your rich relation for some money next week and keep your IOE promise. So please cough up, be generous, or make a commitment. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Blackbirds. I'm going to find you rich aunties. This is our...
Give me the money.
Yeah, right, so our last speaker, but by no means least, has had possibly one of the most helpful few, I'd say, years and a half, perhaps, in running himself in the Wigan by-election, and of course having a presidential campaign, well, presidential candidacy campaign on the family. So I'd like to welcome Larry Sanders.
Well, thank you very much. It's a little bit odd at the age of 81 to be introduced as a brother of, but he couldn't be a better brother, so I'm not too unhappy about it. But I do want to also start from another angle, the other part of my life, which is I'm presently the Green Party spokesperson on health and social care. So I come to this, we're coming today to this meeting from two angles in a way. The threat of nuclear weapons, the continuing threat, which is all times, in virtually all of my lifetime, has hung over us, and which, as we've heard, is by no means gone away, and in some ways is more threatening than ever. The other side of it is the austerity, is the redistribution of wealth, what we have had, and the statistics are so utterly clear, this is not a question for debate. Over the last 40 years, the wealth and income in all the industrial countries of the world, some more and some less, so there are real differences. And two of the forerunners are the United States and Britain. But wealth and income have been flowing from the bulk of the population to the very richest people. Now, part of the uneasiness in the sense that we have, and I think quite legitimately have, that we are not in a stable world, that we do not know whether things cannot get a lot worse. And I think we are in that world, and things could get a lot worse, and the events of the elections involving Brexit and the election now of Donald Trump, an enormously dangerous figure, are a sign of something that has happened. They are what they are, and they are dangerous to the future, but they are also symptomatic of something that has happened. And that something is the systematic deprivation of large chunks of the population. Some are suffering dramatically, and we pass every day more people on the streets in colder and colder weather, looking more and more ill. Other people manage quite well, but their incomes and their futures have been diminished because of this enormous flood, and others are someplace in that long range. But where we are going, I don't know, and I'm not as optimistic now. I hope I'm not just being a tribal Green Party person. I'm not as optimistic about the Corbyn administration, and I'm very sorry that John McDonnell is not here tonight because I have questions to ask him. In my concern about the NHS, and I want to say, if anybody in this room does not understand that a good quality, public, free of point of use health service will not be here in 4 years unless something very dramatic happens. That is absolutely the case. £22 billion, and some people say it's 25 billion, are being taken out. No, they're not being taken out. That's oversimplistic. What is happening is that a trivial amount of money is going into the health service. The increased need, based on our population, based on the growing number of people with multiple chronic illnesses, based on the huge increase in the number of people over 85, based on the increase, the lovely increase in medical capacity. We need something like 3.5% or 4% a year. We are getting something like 0.5% a year extra. The NHS leadership, which is a privatizing leadership, it's not a radical leadership. It's not people that we are, people in this room would be very delighted with, have said very clearly that if nothing changes, if we carry on with the same level of work that we do now in the NHS, by 2020-21, there would be a £30 billion gap. And the government has said that they put in 10 billion, and everybody yelled at them and said it's not more than 8 billion, and then some people went and looked at the figures more closely, and if you take out the double counting, it's 4 or 5 billion. So we have a gap something between 20 and 25 billion. This is absolutely insupportable in the sense of having a decent health service. It cannot be done safely. What they are saying is the way that they're going to do it is, first of all, we're going to have integration. Well, I was a county council for 8 years, and I worked almost every day of those 8 years on integration, and we made some progress. There is no big money in integrating services. It's the right thing to do, and we should work at it, but it's in tens of millions of savings, and often it costs more money, because if you make your access more viable, more connected, more people use the service, which is not a bad thing, but it's not a way of saving money. And the other big saving is that they say everybody knows that nobody wants to be in hospital. Hospitals are very dangerous places. Well, they're completely correct. But we already have the second lowest ratio of beds to population in the industrial world. Those cuts of hospital beds have happened. They are not there for the plucking. Those closures which are happening, which every day and every week now you will see in the newspapers, in every area in which you live, those are cuts into a already limited service. We do not have enough doctors, we do not have enough nurses, we do not have enough auxiliary staff, we do not have enough hospital beds. So this is the area in which these enormous cuts are being made. And two things to be said within that are even that are more frightening. First of all, the health service has been, to a large extent, not to a large extent, but substantially privatized. There are several things wrong with that. First of all, privatizing is very bad for a health service because it creates an immediate conflict of interest for every clinician. He or she has to think, is this good for my employer? Is this good for our profit line? If we do not succeed in terms of profit, we do not succeed. This business, this hospital, this surgery goes out of business. And the second thing is to create a structure in which privatization can take place is very expensive. It costs us something like £5 billion a year just to have that structure in place. And the second thing that I want to add to that is this is where my concern about the Labour Party and John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn comes in. If you want to ask me, is the Labour Party committed to restoring the money that needs to be restored to have a viable health service? And do you know what the answer to that is? The answer is no. I was on a radio program with Diane Abbott, and I had seen it in the newspaper the week before, a couple of months ago, and it had said there that the Labour Party, that this is Diane Abbott, this is not the pathetic parliamentary Labour Party, this is the best end of the Labour Party. They were saying that they would maintain the same ratio between national income and NHS funding that there was at the moment. Now, if you have, and I said to Diane, who's a lovely woman with enormous history, I said to her, if you have Tory ratios, you will have Tory cuts. And she said, oh, no, the Tories will cut it even further. And that is the height of that thing. So we have a situation in which the basic thing of having a health service which will be good enough for us and the people we care for and the rest of the people that we don't even know, who we want to do well, that's at risk. So we're in the midst of a system which for 40 years has been redistributing wealth, and redistribution is supposed to be a naughty word. They have been redistributing wealth from the bulk of the population to the rich. We have difficult problems at the best parts of our political life, and we have threats, enormous threats. I think the Donald Trump threat cannot be overestimated. And we have not yet got the fight back. I'm very pleased that my Green Party is improving, growing in size. Our policies are all there. We will fill that gap, and we will tell you exactly how we will do it. And the whole idea of debt, we don't have the time to go into it now. It is a rubbish idea. We have the capacity to do all that we need to do. These businesses of debts and deficits are nonsense. But we don't yet have the beginning of a fight back. We have the beginning of it in America. My brother stands for something, and when he stands up, millions and millions of people are ready to listen to him. He didn't win, and the worst candidate did win. So there are huge dangers, and I don't want to underestimate them. But in America, there is hope. I don't see that happening yet in this country. You in this room are a very small number, but you have to take that responsibility. You indeed are the hope. Thank you.
So that we're now again open the floor for questions, if you have any. Same as before, if you ask, say who it's addressed to, and try and keep it short and sweet. The whereabouts of the microphone?
The microphone is what's causing the feedback, so if you can speak without it.
That's a question to Laurie Sanders. You say that.
Stand up.
You say that we need to kind of get the fight back going for the NHS, but how do we do that when there's such a large right-wing press that fail to report on all the cuts in the NHS, especially over the last kind of few months with the whole US election, and they kind of sneak in those the bills of privatisation in there when kind of focus is elsewhere. So how do we kind of build that fight back when we've got everything against us?
I mean, you're 100% right. And if I knew, I would be addressing you as an MP, instead of having somebody who got about 3.7% of the vote. You're right. In America, the obvious, horrendous scandal of money dominating politics, buying politicians, buying governments, and so on, has come clear, partly through Bernard's work and but other people as well over many years. We have a similar thing. Money is not so big in this country, but we have a domination of an astonishingly right-wing, astonishingly nasty set of newspapers, and it is very difficult, but we have to do it. I mean, that's not the end of it.
So I think you over there had your hand up first. If you'd like to stand up and say a question. Try and speak so everyone can hear you with that.
How do you see history repeating itself in the United States with another perfect storm of different nationalist agendas coming together as in Weimar Germany, or is this a completely different type of thing? I mean, that's the story, that's a thunderstrike twice.
Gosh. Well, I mean, the obvious and right answer is I don't have a clue. I think that there is hope, and I may well be wrong. The hope is that in the recent elections, in the primaries, Bernard was getting the vote of the young people, and by young they went up to 35, 40 years of age, and an incredible thing, 70, 80% of the vote. Now, the great thing about young people is they hang around a while, and they are, to some extent, and perhaps to a great extent, politicized. They know a great deal about what's happening, and I'm hopeful that enormous number of vigorous young people could make the difference. It doesn't mean there aren't enormous threats. The huge power of the government is in the hands of the worst lot of people, I think, perhaps ever. But there is hope, I think, in her. Is that?
So you don't think there will be the rise of another Nazi state?
I don't see it now, no.
Question from Bruce at the front.
I'd just like to answer the first question that came up. I get leaflets from the Royal Free and the Witty Bill, all about the tragedy of the cuts and so on. So never have I seen on a leaflet any connection with the 205 billion we're going to spend on nuclear weapons. We have to get into the pressure groups who are actually pushing for the NHS and make sure that these issues come up on their literature, because you can't afford an NHS and 205 billion pounds on more nuclear weapons. But we have to be there at the cold face of getting these things done. Thank you.
Some questions about that?
My name's Alex. I just want to start by saying I think the work that CND do is really great. They diminish ignorance, such a frictional force of the human movement. I guess my question lies in, could war ever stop? If you look throughout history and you look at humanity as a species, we are so war-centric. I mean, there's no way that wars could totally stop at this very moment. There's too much history. There's too much there for everyone. I believe that unity is something that we should be striving for, and peace as well. So, with that said, do you think that one world government eventually could solve the problem of war?
Who wants to take that?
Sure. Go, Madam Mayor, go. Thanks very much. And of course, the question you asked there about a one world government, I mean, that has strong historical roots, as you probably know. After the Second World War, not only was the United Nations set up specifically with that aim of ending war, and also specifically with the aim of ending nuclear weapons, but there was something actually called the World Government Movement, which was determined to end national boundaries, conflict between nations, unity amongst the peoples. And I believe that even though wars continue, that desire from the overwhelming majority of people that is very, very strong, and that is the majority desire. I mean, just in terms of nuclear weapons, over half the globe is actually self-organised into nuclear weapons-free zones, you know, and as I said before, you know, this big drive for a global ban on nuclear weapons. And I personally believe that that instinct, the humanitarian peace-loving instinct, is the strongest instinct. You know, I mean, look at the people who are fleeing with their families away from war. They don't want to fight. They want to be able to bring up their families in peace, you know, and work and prosper and so on. You know, that's the human instinct. But at the same time, you do have political elites, you know, or capitalism or imperialism or however you want to describe it, you know, people who seek power and seek power through exploiting other peoples. You know, we've seen the whole history of colonialism, extracting resources, getting rich and so on, you know. So a very small minority of people actually benefit through war, the whole process of war, you know. And I think part of our campaign, you know, as you say, we're a kind of strong campaign, a long-lasting campaign, you know, unity together in those types of campaigns is the way to make sure that what the majority wants is actually asserted. You know, it's possible if we, as the people, get together and make clear our demands and refuse to go along with war anymore. So I think it can be done, it's possible, you know, but it's a big task.
I think there is one more question at the back, was there? All right. Is that a question in the hand at the back? Yeah. Do you want to maybe come to the front of the mic or Carol, just so everyone can hear?
Hello, my name is Shabbir, and I would like to know whether Pakistan will be disarmed nuclear. And also to the history, British involved in Asia, which was the one country, Afghanistan, that they never succeed there, and their policy that they always friendly to Pakistan, and Afghanistan suffering from that Mark-Duran line, you know, they make that line. What do you think about this? How long will be Britain solving this problem or not? And also, is the current division in Iraq and being called, you know, dividing Iraq, is that going to be another Duran line? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that. I mean, in terms of the role of Britain in that region, you know, the role of Britain has been a complete disaster. I mean, in terms of the history of the so-called British Empire, you know, they started off pretty much in Afghanistan, you know, and then, of course, the British Empire in India. And everywhere that Britain has been involved, it's created you know, a disastrous situation for those populations, not only in terms of extraction of resources, you know, their strategic interests stamping all over the population, you know, going in regime change in their own political interests, you know. And why? What right does Britain ever have to be in any of those countries? All it's done is create a legacy of terrible political conflict, economic problems and so on. And the same with regard to the situation in Iraq. You know, Britain's intervention in the Middle East, you know, whether it was you know, intervening in against the elected Iraqi government in the 1960s, or against the Iranian government of Mossadegh, you know, an elected government, always intervening, you know, over oil in particular in the Middle East, a completely disastrous situation. And that's one of the reasons why the anti-war movement has always said, and Shabbir made this point earlier on, you know, Western intervention, or indeed any kind of foreign intervention in countries' problems and in their situations, is absolutely wrong. It is not the people who are imperialists and colonialists in those countries. What is their military intervention going to do to solve any of those regional problems? Absolutely none whatsoever. You know, so we have to be out of those countries and show respect, and in fact have foreign policies that are based on mutual respect and fair treatment, just economic relations between countries. And with regard to Pakistan's nuclear weapons, you know, we want to see the elimination of all nuclear weapons. And I was very pleased to see, as I mentioned earlier, that in terms of the global ban treaty, okay, Pakistan didn't vote in favour of that treaty, but it abstained on it. So I think it's open to that process. You know, I think any kind of writing to or lobbying of the governments of those countries, anything like that, would be very, very good, you know, because we have to bring about a transformation of those countries, not only in terms of freedom and independence and so on, self-determination, but also not to have the plague of nuclear weapons in those lands either.
One more question. So, I don't know who wants to take that.
My question goes to Larry Sanders, and it's about why he sees no hope in the Labour Party when it's returned to its union roots, it's returned to being a true workers' party, whereas in the US, there is no workers' party. The Democrats and the Republicans really serve the left and right wings of capital.
Well, I got a bit. Well, I'm not going to give a good answer to that, I'm afraid. I'm hopeful also for the Labour Party. I don't know whether calling it a workers' party adds very much anymore. It's not the working class. Like my father-in-law was a member of. It's not limited in that kind of way. It needs to be a party for all the people who are being screwed by the inequality, by the sucking of money and wealth up to the corporate leadership. I think that the United States has limitations in its history, as you will know, but those limitations don't completely govern the future. I'm hopeful for the kind of coalitions that are possible in America. We came very close to having a coalition between the white and black working classes. So I'm dubious about calling the Labour Party, even the Corbynite Labour Party, or the Workers' Party. I have hope in it. There are an extraordinary number of very committed people there. Their job is harder than it looks like, I think, because they are faced by a parliamentary Labour Party which is particularly feeble and probably quite a bit worse than that. And I wouldn't like to be in Corbyn's position, but I'm glad that he's there. I'm sorry so much.
Right, that's about all we've got time for questions. So just before we wrap up, I've got a few announcements to make. You might have been given one of these. This is our Beats Not Bombs London Youth and Student CND social that's coming up. It's on the 15th of December and it's at the Hive in Dalston. It should be pretty good by the time. We've got an acoustic set by Enter Shikari so far, with more to be announced. So there's that. And if you want to grab a few leaflets for those, they're all at the back that you can go and hand out to all your friends. Hey. As well as that, a massive thanks to our supporting organisations, Veterans for Peace, Campaigning Against the Arms Trade, Stop the War and Disabled People Against Cuts, as well as a massive thanks to London Region CND. Some of our supporters have also got stalls at the back, including Red Strike, which you should definitely go and have a look at. Obviously, a massive thanks to our speakers. Most importantly, after this we are going to the pub. To the Marlborough Arms, which is just sort of, if you head out of the venue and go right down there, then you should see it. If not, follow some of us. Where we can continue our political debate Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.